I'm going to tell you something I haven't told anyone in 34 years. Not because I've been protecting it, not because I was afraid of what would happen if I said it out loud. I've been keeping it because there was no one to tell it to. No one who would understand the full weight of it, who would know what a W900 meant to a man in 1989 in West Texas, who would understand why losing it was the beginning and not the end, and why the disappearing that followed was not the tragedy, but the only logical conclusion to a sequence of events that I set in motion and that set me in motion, and that I've been moving with ever since. I'm 61 years old. I'm sitting in a room in a town I'm not going to name, in a state I'm not going to name, and outside the window there's a highway I can see from where I'm sitting, just a piece of it, a quarter-mile of asphalt visible between two buildings. And on that highway, occasionally, a truck goes past. When a truck goes past, I watch it the way you watch something you used to be. My name now is not the name I was born with. It hasn't been for 34 years. The name I was born with was Eddie Crane, and Eddie Crane drove a 1987 Kenworth W900 out of Lubbock, Texas, from 1986 until the evening of September 14th, 1989, which is the evening I lost the truck and lost the name and lost the man who had been building himself inside both of them for 27 years. I want to tell you who Eddie Crane was before I tell you what happened to him, because the story doesn't make sense without that, and because Eddie Crane deserves to be known before he disappears again at the end of this telling. Eddie Crane was from Odessa, Texas. Born 1963, the second of 3 boys, to a man who worked the oil fields and a woman who kept the house and the family together with the specific competence of a woman who understands that the competence is not optional. His father was not a bad man. He was an absent man, absent in the physical sense when the work took him away, and absent in the present sense when the work brought him home depleted in ways that left nothing for the boys. His mother filled the gap the way mothers fill gaps, which is to say imperfectly and completely, and Eddie Crane grew up understanding 2 things clearly: that the work a man does is what he is, and that leaving is not always the same as abandoning. He drove for the first time at 14, in his uncle's flatbed on a ranch road outside Odessa. He had his commercial license at 18, which was legal in Texas in 1981, and he was running freight by 19. Not long haul at first, local and regional, the kind of work that builds hours and builds the specific body knowledge of a working driver. He drove for other people for 6 years. He saved what he could, which wasn't much, and he borrowed what he couldn't save, which was more than it should have been, and in the spring of 1986, at 23 years old, he bought the W900. A 1987 Kenworth W900, pre-production model. The dealer in Lubbock had 3 of them, and Eddie Crane bought the one with the longest wheelbase and the biggest sleeper because he intended to live in it, which he did. Midnight blue cab, chrome package, Cummins big cam engine that had a sound you felt in your chest before you heard it with your ears. He'd chosen the color deliberately, not because blue was his favorite, but because the dealer had offered a discount on the midnight blue, and Eddie Crane was 23, and practical in the way that men are practical when they've borrowed more than they should have. He named it. Drivers name their trucks sometimes, and sometimes they don't, and the ones who do tend to be the ones for whom the truck is something more than equipment. Eddie Crane named his truck Margaret, which was his mother's name, which was not something he told anyone at the time, and which I'm telling you now because there's no one left to be embarrassed by it. Margaret. He ran the W900 for 3 years. The Lubbock to El Paso run primarily, with branches north into the Panhandle and south into the Permian Basin, where the oil field work produced a specific type of freight, equipment, chemicals, pipe, that paid better than produce, and required the kind of driver who could handle wide loads on narrow roads in heat that turned the asphalt soft. Eddie Crane could handle that. He was good at the job in the unself-conscious way that young men are good at things before they understand that being good at something is not the same as being safe. If you've ever put everything you had into one thing, one truck, one name, one version of yourself built on a specific kind of work, subscribe before I go any further. Because what I lost in September of 1989 was not just a truck, and what I became after losing it is the reason I'm telling this story now, 34 years later, to a camera in a room in a town I'm not going to name. The summer of 1989 was hot in West Texas, in the way that West Texas summers are hot. Not the humid heat that the Gulf Coast has, not the baking heat of the desert that tourists imagine when they think of Texas. The specific dry heat of the Llano Estacado, the high plains, where the elevation keeps the nights cooler than they should be, and the days are white and total, and the wind comes out of the southwest, carrying dust from the Chihuahuan desert, and nothing stops it for 300 miles in any direction. I was running hard that summer. 3 years into the W900, the loan almost paid, the routes established, the shippers reliable. What I mean by running hard is this. I was taking every load Roy offered, and some he didn't offer, because I found them through the CB network, through other drivers mentioning freight that needed moving on routes that I could cover. The motivation wasn't desperation. The motivation was proximity to something I'd wanted for a long time, which was the loan paid and the truck genuinely mine, and the next thing, whatever the next thing was, becoming possible. There's a specific quality to the months before a thing becomes possible. You can feel the approach of it. The numbers are right, the accounts are right, the equipment is right, and the future that you've been building has enough of a shape that you can see it clearly enough to describe it. I could see mine in the summer of 1989. 2 trucks, a second driver. I'd been thinking about a man named Curtis who drove regional for another Lubbock outfit, and who I'd worked alongside enough to know he was reliable and careful and would treat a truck he didn't own the way he'd treat one he did, which is not a given and is the thing you need to know about a man before you put him in your equipment. I was going to talk to Curtis in October. That was the plan. Finish the summer, make the last few loan payments, talk to Curtis in October, have the second truck running by spring of 1990. The plan was specific enough to have dates on it, which is the kind of plan that feels like the future has already agreed to cooperate. The future had different plans. The last run before the Midland Flying J and Deke Holloway was an equipment run from Lubbock to a drill site south of Midland, pipe and drilling components, a load that required care on the county roads approaching the site because the roads were caliche and loose in the summer heat, and a heavy load on caliche in July requires a specific kind of attention to the steering. I made the delivery, cleared the site by 2 in the afternoon, and headed back north toward Midland to fuel before continuing to Lubbock. That was when I stopped at the Flying J. That was when Deke sat down. I want to tell you about the conversation with Tommy more completely, because I compressed it earlier, and the compression left out the part that I've thought about most. He was at the kitchen table with the cereal when I came in. My mother was in the back of the house. I could hear the television, one of the daytime programs she watched, the kind of sound that meant she was in the house and occupied, and I had a few minutes before she'd come to find out who'd come through the door. Tommy looked up when I sat down. He had the expression of a man who has been expecting something and is trying to read from the messenger's face how bad it is. He was 20 years old. He had my father's eyes, which were blue and direct, and my mother's mouth, which meant he smiled easily when things were good and showed everything when they weren't. Things weren't good. His face said so before I said anything. I told him what Deke had told me. I told him all of it, which took about 10 minutes. He didn't interrupt. Tommy had learned from me, when we were boys, that interrupting was how you missed the important part, and whatever else he'd gotten wrong at 20, he hadn't gotten that wrong. When I finished, he looked at the cereal. It had gone soggy. He looked at it for a while. Then he said, "How much do you know?" "Enough," I said. "Did Deke say who told him?" "No. Doesn't matter." "It matters because—" "Tommy." I said his name the way older brothers say names when they need the younger one to stop moving in the wrong direction. He stopped. He said, "I didn't think it would get to this." "Nobody thinks it will get to this," I said. And then it does. He was quiet for a moment. He pushed the cereal away. "What are you going to do?" he said. I told him. Watching his face while I told him was one of the harder things I've done, and I've done some hard things in 61 years. He went from the expression of someone being told a plan to the expression of someone understanding what the plan costs, and the understanding happened in stages. Each stage arriving as a new piece of the cost became visible. When I was done, he said, "You can't do that." "I can," I said. "I'm going to." "Eddie, you have one job," I said. "You know what it is." He knew. We'd talked about it. What Tommy needed to do, where he needed to be, who he needed to talk to, and who he needed to not talk to. The specific sequence of actions that would allow the situation to resolve without him at the center of it. It wasn't complicated. It required him to be somewhere specific and stay there and not make any decisions for about 2 weeks. "I can do that," he said. "I know you can." He looked at me for a long moment. 20 years old, blue eyes, my mother's mouth. "When will you come back?" he said. I didn't answer that. He understood from the not answering. "Eddie," he said. His voice had changed, not breaking, but close to the edge that isn't breaking. "Don't," I said. He didn't. We sat at the kitchen table for another few minutes without talking. The television was still going in the back of the house. My mother hadn't come to find out who'd arrived. Then I stood up. "Take care of Mama," I said. He said, "I will." That was the whole goodbye with Tommy. "I'll call you," I said to my mother on the way out. "Take care of Mama," I said to my brother at the kitchen table. I drove back to Midland, and I did what needed to be done. Now, let me tell you about the Arkansas years, because they're the years where the new name became real, and that process is not nothing. The carrier I found work with in 1990 was based in Fort Smith, which is on the Oklahoma border, and which runs primarily east into Tennessee and north into Missouri. Regional freight, dry van, the kind of work that requires consistent reliability more than any specific skill. I was good at consistent reliability. I'd been practicing it since I was 19. The first year under the new name was the hardest year of the 30, and I want to be accurate about why. It wasn't the work. The work was the same work I'd been doing, and the road doesn't care what your driver's license says. It was the social fabric of it. Being a driver in a carrier's operation involves a community, dispatchers, dock workers, other drivers who run the same corridors. And that community is built on knowing who you are. Your name, your history, your truck, your regular stops. The community of the road is built on repetition, on the recognition that comes from seeing the same face at the same truck stop on the same corridor over months and years. I was the new face. I had a history that I couldn't tell accurately and a name that I'd had for a year and that I was still constructing into something that felt like mine rather than borrowed. Every conversation that went past the surface, "Where are you from? Where were you before? How long have you been driving?" required a version of myself that I was still building. I got better at it. Not at lying. I want to be careful about that word, because what I was doing wasn't lying in the straightforward sense. It was building a person. The person I was building had a history that was mostly true, relocated from Texas to New Mexico. Some of the early years adjusted. The specific identifiers changed. The emotional content of it was true. The love of the road, the preference for long hauls over regional, the feeling about what trucks are and what driving them means. Those things were Eddie Crane's, and they were also mine, because they were the same person, just differently documented. By the end of the second year in Arkansas, the new name felt like mine. Not because I'd forgotten Eddie Crane. I hadn't, and I haven't, which is part of why I'm sitting in this room with a camera on September of 2023 talking about September of 1989. But because the living of a name makes it real in a way that the issuing of it doesn't. You answer to it enough times, you sign it enough times, you hear it from enough people who mean it when they say it, and it becomes yours. The dispatcher in Fort Smith, a woman named Barbara, who ran the schedule with the precise efficiency of a woman who had been doing logistics since before I was born, started calling me by a nickname in the second year. Not my name, a nickname derived from it. One of those dispatcher shorthand handles that develops organically in any operation where the same people are talking over the radio every day. She called me by that nickname for 8 years, until I moved on to the Tennessee run, and when I left, she shook my hand and said, "You're the most reliable driver I've had in 12 years." I thought about Roy Billings when she said that. I thought about it a lot. The Tennessee years and the Ohio years and the Midwest years are their own story, and a long one, and the shape of them is the same. Different road, same driver, the new name becoming more completely real with each year of it. I married once, in Ohio, which lasted 4 years and ended without drama or particular injury, the kind of ending that happens when two people have been kind to each other but haven't been quite the right fit, and have both understood this for longer than they admitted. She knew my name, the current one. She didn't know Eddie Crane. When it ended, she moved back to Cincinnati, and I moved to the Illinois runs, and we've been in no contact since, which is the correct outcome for that kind of ending. I told her once, the only time I came close to telling anyone in 30 years, that I hadn't always been who I was. I said it obliquely, in the way you say things when you're testing whether the door opens. She said, "Who has?" And I said, "Fair point." And that was the closest I came. The logbooks are in the box. The box is in the corner. That's the whole inventory of what Eddie Crane left behind. I knew Deke Holloway the way you know men you've been running the same roads with for 3 years. By sight, by truck, by reputation. He drove a red Peterbilt 359 for an outfit based in Abilene, and he ran the same Permian Basin routes I ran, which meant we saw each other at truck stops and way stations with enough regularity to be familiar without being friends. He was maybe 40, lean, with the look of a man who'd been in the sun for most of his adult life and who had stopped being bothered by it. He sat down across from me, and he put his hands flat on the table and he said, "I need to talk to you about Tommy Crane, my younger brother, 20 years old, Odessa." I put my coffee down. Tommy Crane had been the one my mother worried about. Not because he was bad. He wasn't, not at heart. But because he was 20, and the Permian Basin in 1989 had specific things to offer a 20-year-old man with more confidence than judgment, and some of those things were the kind that follow you. Tommy had been following them since he was 17. Not seriously, or not seriously enough to have consequences yet, but in the way that a thing that doesn't have consequences yet is accumulating them. What Deke Holloway told me in the Midland Flying J on the afternoon of September 13th, 1989, took about 15 minutes. He told it carefully and without embellishment, the way men tell things when they need the other person to hear it accurately rather than emotionally. He'd been at a yard in Odessa the previous week, loading equipment for a Permian Basin site. He'd seen Tommy, not driving, Tommy didn't drive commercially, in the company of 2 men that Deke recognized from a specific context that I won't detail here, because the specifics of that context are not the point and are not mine to put in a public record. The point is that Tommy was in the company of men who were going to give him consequences that he hadn't accumulated yet, and the consequences were the kind that you don't manage your way out of once they arrive. I listened to Deke Holloway for 15 minutes. When he was done, I thanked him. He said, "I don't know what you're going to do with it." I said, "Neither do I yet." He nodded and stood up and went back to his Peterbilt, and I never saw Deke Holloway again after that, which is how it is with the men you know by truck and route. They're there until they aren't, and the road doesn't pause to mark the transition. I sat in the Flying J diner for an hour after Deke left. Not because I needed an hour to decide. I needed the hour to understand what I'd already decided. The decision was this. I was going to go to Odessa and get my brother out of the situation he was in, and the getting him out was going to require me to do something that would make it impossible for me to remain Eddie Crane afterward. I understood that before I understood the specifics of how, because the specifics come second. The decision is the thing that determines everything downstream of it, and the decision was already made while Deke Holloway was still talking. I'm going to be careful here about what I describe specifically, because 34 years is a long time, but certain statutes aren't, and certain people are still alive, and my intention in telling this story is not to create problems for people who have built lives on the assumption that the past is the past. What I will say is this. There was money involved. There was money that Tommy had gotten involved with in the way that young men get involved with money that belongs to someone who will eventually want it back, and the wanting it back was coming before Tommy had it to give. And there was a way to make the situation resolve that required me to do something with my truck and my roots and my identity that would allow Tommy to be somewhere else when the resolution happened. I drove to Odessa on the morning of September 14th. The drive from Midland to Odessa is about 20 miles on the I-20, which is the shortest drive I'd done in years on the W900. The truck felt different on that short drive, heavier than its weight, or I felt it differently, the way you feel a thing differently when you know it's the last time. I found Tommy at my mother's house, which is where I'd known he'd be, because Tommy Crane went to my mother's house when things were wrong, the way water goes downhill. He was in the kitchen eating cereal at 11 in the morning with the focused attention of a man who is not thinking about the cereal. I sat down across from him. I told him what Deke had told me. Tommy didn't deny it. He was 20, not stupid, and denial wasn't going to work on his older brother who'd driven 20 miles to tell him this at 11 in the morning on a Thursday. He sat with his cereal and he looked at the table and he said, "I didn't mean for it to get this far." I said, "I know. Here's what's going to happen." I told him what I was going to do. He argued, the way younger brothers argue, with more passion than logic, with the specific helplessness of someone who can see that the older one has made a decision and that the decision isn't changing. I let him argue until he ran out. Then I said, "Do you understand what I need from you?" He understood. My mother was in the other room. She heard enough of it to know something was happening, and not enough of it to know what. When I went to say goodbye to her, and I knew it was goodbye, though I didn't say that word, she held my hands the way she held hands when she was worried, both of hers around both of mine. She said, "Eddie, what's wrong?" I said, "Nothing, Mama. I've got to run." She looked at me for a long moment. My mother was not a woman who missed things. She said, "When will you be back?" I said, "I'll call you." I drove back to Midland in the W900. I went through the sequence of things that needed to happen in the order they needed to happen. I called Roy Billings and told him I had a family situation and would be off route for a few days. Roy asked no questions. Roy was that kind of dispatcher. I drove to the yard where I kept the truck, and I took out the things I was taking with me, which were few. The photograph I kept on the visor, my mother, 1981, standing in front of the house in Odessa with the specific expression of a woman who has survived more than most and is not finished. My logbooks. $300 in cash from the envelope I kept in the door pocket for emergencies. I left the W900 in the yard. I left it in the spot I always parked it, facing out for easy pullout, the way I'd parked it for 3 years. I stood beside it for a few minutes. The Midland afternoon was doing what Midland afternoons do in September. The white heat, the dry wind, the sky so large it seems to be pressing down rather than holding up. The chrome on the cab caught the light. The midnight blue paint had faded slightly in the sun over 3 years, which happens to dark colors in West Texas, and I'd been meaning to have it touched up and never had. Margaret. I put my hand on the hood. Then I walked away. I won't tell you what happened with the situation involving Tommy, because that's not my story to tell in a public record. What I'll tell you is that it resolved, and that Tommy Crane is alive, and has been alive for 34 years, and has a family and a job and a life that is built on the assumption that what almost happened in 1989 didn't happen, which is an assumption I've spent 34 years protecting. What happened to Eddie Crane is the part I can tell. Eddie Crane got on a Greyhound bus in Midland, Texas, on the evening of September 14, 1989, with $300 and a duffel bag and a decision that had been made and couldn't be unmade. He rode the bus to Albuquerque. In Albuquerque, he found work at a diner for 3 weeks, cash, enough to put something together. In Albuquerque, he also found a man who could help with the kind of paperwork that a man needs when he's going to stop being who he was and start being someone else, which in 1989, in certain cities, was a different kind of transaction than it is now. The man who left Albuquerque 6 weeks after arriving was not Eddie Crane. The name he left with is the name I have now and that I'm not going to say, for the reasons I've already stated. He was 27 years old and he'd been driving for 8 years, and he had $300 and a new name and the specific quality of a man who has accepted a trade that he did not fully price in advance. The W900 stayed in the Midland Yard for 2 weeks after I left. Roy Billings tried to reach me, couldn't, and eventually arranged for the truck to be taken against the remaining balance on the loan, which was small, less than a year's worth of payments, but enough that the lender had a legal basis for the action. The lender took the truck. What happened to it after that, I don't know, and have never tried to find out, because finding out would require looking in a direction that I've been deliberately not looking for 34 years. The man who walked out of Albuquerque drove for 30 more years under a different name. Not in Texas. I moved east, then north, then eventually to the room where I'm sitting now, which is in a state that is not Texas and that has a highway visible from the window. I drove regional freight for 12 years, long haul for 10, and retired at 58 because the knees went and the eye doctor started talking about things I didn't want to hear. I drove clean for 30 years under the name that isn't Eddie Crane, and when I retired, the record was clean, and the dispatcher I worked for in the last years gave me a handshake and said, "You're the most reliable driver I've had in 20 years." I thought about Roy Billings when he said that. I thought about what Roy would have said if I'd stayed. My mother died in 2011. I found out from Tommy, who had my phone number, the only person who did. He called and said, "Mama's gone." I said, "When?" He said, "Yesterday." I said, "Okay." We stayed on the phone for a while without saying much. Tommy has a wife and 2 daughters and a job at a freight company in Odessa, not driving, dispatching, which is the kind of thing that happens when a crane man ends up in the freight industry but doesn't get behind the wheel. I've met his daughters once in a parking lot in Amarillo in 2019, which was the closest I've come to Texas since 1989. They're good girls. They don't know who I am. They know me as a friend of their father's from a long time ago. My mother didn't know where I'd gone. That's the part that has the most weight, 34 years later. She knew something had happened. She was my mother. She knew something had happened before I left the kitchen. But she didn't know what. And she didn't know why. And she didn't know that when I said I'll call you, I meant I won't call you. Because calling you makes it possible to find you, and finding you makes it possible to find Tommy. And finding Tommy undoes the thing I just did. Tommy knew. He called her. He told me this years later, and told her I was okay. He told her there had been a situation and that Eddie was fine and that she shouldn't worry and shouldn't ask questions. She was my mother. She asked questions. Tommy answered what he could and didn't answer what he couldn't, and she lived with that for 22 years until she died in 2011, and I wasn't there. That's the cost I didn't price in advance. The 22 years my mother spent not knowing where her son was. The specific quality of a mother's not knowing, which is different from anyone else's not knowing, because a mother's not knowing is never at rest, never fully set aside, always present in the back of everything. I've thought about it every day for 34 years. Not with guilt, exactly. Guilt implies a belief that the decision was wrong, and I don't believe that. With grief, which is different and heavier in some ways, because grief doesn't have the relief valve that guilt does. Guilt can be discharged. You atone, or you're forgiven, or you change. Grief just sits there, in the specific shape of the thing you lost, unchanged by time or distance, or 34 years of a different name. The W900, Margaret, midnight blue with chrome, the hood dented on the driver's side from a loading dock in Pecos in 1988 that I'd been meaning to have fixed. The sound of the Cummins big cam engine starting on a cold West Texas morning. That specific ignition sequence, the cough, and then the settle into a sound that you felt in the chest. The photograph on the visor, my mother in front of the Odessa house. I left the photograph. I should have taken it. I've thought about that more times than I can count. Why I left it when I took the logbooks. Why the photograph stayed on the visor of a truck that was going to be repossessed and sent to a lot and eventually sold. I don't have a good answer. I think I left it because taking it felt like taking her with me, and taking her with me felt like endangering her in ways I couldn't calculate. I left the photograph on the visor of a midnight blue W900 in a yard in Midland, Texas, on the evening of September 14, 1989. There's a truck going past on the highway outside the window right now. A Kenworth, not a W900, something newer, a T680 maybe, white, running west. I watched it until it disappeared behind the far building, and then I sat here for a moment, and then I started talking again, into this camera, in this room, in a town I'm not going to name. Tommy is 60 years old now. His daughters are grown. His wife teaches school. He goes to church, which is something he didn't do in 1989, and he coaches a youth baseball league in the spring, which is something I learned from the one phone call a year we have on the Saturday closest to September 14th, because that date means something different to both of us, and we mark it the only way we know how, which is a phone call and not many words, and then goodbye until next year. He asked me once, this was maybe 15 years ago, the September 14th call, if I regretted it. I said, no. He said, I do. Every day. I said, you're not allowed to. That's not the deal. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, what is the deal? I said, the deal is you lived. The deal is you built something. The deal is your girls exist. That's the deal. He said, Eddie. It was the first time anyone had called me Eddie in 30 years. I didn't correct him. I said, I know. The highway outside the window is empty now. The white Kenworth has been gone for 10 minutes, and nothing has come behind it. The afternoon is doing what afternoons do in this part of the country. The light changing, the shadows lengthening, the specific quality of a late afternoon that is neither day nor night, but the transition between them. I'm 61 years old. I've been two people, and one of them has been gone for 34 years, and the other one is sitting in a room talking to a camera about both of them, because it's September, because it's almost the 14th, because Tommy called last week and said his oldest daughter is pregnant, and there's going to be a great niece or a great nephew that Eddie Crane will never meet, but that exists in the same world that Eddie Crane helped make possible. I don't know what the truck went for. The W900, the repossession, the lot in Midland. I've thought about looking it up. Whatever records exist from that era, whatever paper trail a Kenworth W900 leaves when it moves from one owner to the next and then the next. I haven't done it. Some doors you leave closed, not because you're afraid of what's on the other side, but because opening them requires becoming again the person who stood in front of them, and that person has been gone for 34 years, and he can't come back, and I'm not sure I'd recognize him if he did. Margaret. Midnight blue. The chrome going gold in the West Texas afternoon light. The sound of the Cummins big cam settling into its idle, the kind of sound that says, we're not going anywhere yet, but we could. We could go anywhere. I got on a bus instead. That's the story. The whole of it, or the whole of it that I can tell. If you found your way here, to this room, to this telling, thank you for that. I don't have a call to action for you. I don't have a subscribe button that means anything to Eddie Crane, who doesn't exist on the internet and never will. What I have is this. If you've ever made a trade that you couldn't fully price in advance, you know what the paying of it looks like. It looks like 34 years. It looks like a phone call once a year on the 14th of September. It looks like a highway visible from a window and a truck going past that you watch until it disappears. It looks like this. Whatever road you're on, roll safe. Roll safe and know what you're carrying, because you're always carrying more than the manifest says. There are things I left out of that telling because I was moving toward the end of it, and some things I've been carrying for so long that putting them in order is harder than putting the end first. Let me go back. The 3 years with the W900 before September of 1989 were the best 3 years of my life. I want to say that plainly, without qualifying it or softening it into something more complicated than it is, because it's true, and because the truth of it is part of what September 14th cost. The best 3 years of my life ended on that date, and I'm not going to pretend they didn't, and I'm not going to pretend that the trade, Tommy alive and building and his daughters existing, makes the loss small. The trade was worth making. The loss was real. The W900 and I ran the West Texas freight corridors in a rhythm that I can still feel in my body 34 years later. The Lubbock to El Paso run on the US 62, which cuts through the Guadalupe Mountains on the New Mexico side and has a quality at dawn that I've never seen replicated anywhere else I've driven. The light coming over the Guadalupes from the east, orange and flat, hitting the white salt flats of the Tularosa Basin and bouncing back up in a way that makes the whole landscape look like it's generating its own light. I ran that stretch at dawn when I could time it that way, which wasn't always, but when I could. The Permian Basin runs were different, shorter, more stops, the oil field roads that weren't always paved, and that tested the W900 suspension in ways that the highway runs didn't. I liked those runs too, though differently. The oil field roads have a rawness to them, the machinery everywhere, the smell of crude on the wind, the specific population of men who work those fields, who have a relationship with machinery that drivers understand even when the machinery is different. We were all of us in service to something that didn't care about us personally, moving things that the world needed, in conditions that the world didn't think much about. Roy Billings found me good work. I want to say that about Roy because he's been dead since 2003. I found that out from a driver I ran into in Albuquerque years later who'd worked for Roy after me. And Roy Billings deserves to be in this record as the man who was fair when fairness cost him something. He paid on time. He didn't ask his drivers to run illegal hours or carry loads that weren't correctly manifested. He told me once, over coffee at a truck stop in La Mesa, that the way he looked at it was, these men are carrying something that belongs to somebody else, and that means I'm responsible for them carrying it correctly, and correctly means legally and safely, and compensated at a rate that doesn't make a man cut corners to make rent. Roy was 60 then. He'd been dispatching since 1965. He understood the industry in the way that people understand things they've been in for a long time. Not theoretically, but in the body, in the specific weight of each decision and what it costs when it's made wrong. He was the kind of dispatcher that I tried to be in the years after, when I dispatched briefly and badly and realized that dispatching requires a temperament I don't entirely have. I told Roy once, this was the winter of 1988, we were at the La Mesa truck stop again, which was our informal meeting point, that I was thinking about a second truck, a second driver, expanding the operation. He looked at me for a moment. He said, "You've got one truck and you know it completely. You know that engine the way you know your own heartbeat. A second truck is a different kind of knowledge." I said, "I know. That's what makes it interesting." He looked at me with the expression that Roy got when he was deciding whether to say the thing or not. He said, "Eddie, the best operations I've seen in 30 years are the ones where the man knows his limits and builds inside them. The ones that went wrong always started with a good year and a second truck." I said, "Noted." I went ahead and thought about the second truck anyway, because I was 26 and the good year was happening, and Roy's caution felt like the caution of a man who'd seen failure and was generalizing from it, which is a fair caution and also not the kind that lands at 26. But September of 1989 arrived before the second truck did, which means Roy was right in his way, though not for the reason he was warning about. The second truck never happened, and the first truck went back to the lender, and Eddie Crane got on a bus, and Roy Billings spent 2 weeks trying to reach a man who was no longer the man Roy knew. I think about Roy sometimes. I think about the call he made, the calls, plural, the days of trying to reach me before the conclusion became unavoidable. I think about what he would have thought happened. A man who owed almost nothing on a truck walks away from it without a word. Roy had seen drivers go bad. Money trouble, substance trouble, the specific kinds of deterioration that a dispatcher sees when his drivers start unraveling. And I imagine he categorized my disappearance as one of those, which is the most available explanation, and the wrong one, and one I could never correct. The night in Odessa, before I left. I want to tell you about that night specifically, because it's the night I've thought about most, more than the morning of the 14th, more than the bus out of Midland. After I left my mother's house, after the kitchen table and Tommy and I'll call you, I drove the W900 to the edge of town and parked on a caliche road that I'd driven as a kid, the kind of unpaved road that West Texas has in abundance outside the city limits, that goes somewhere and nowhere at the same time. I killed the engine, and I sat. The Odessa night in September is a specific thing. The heat of the day releases slowly. By 10 o'clock it's bearable. By midnight it's almost cool, and the sky that has been white with heat all day becomes the most star-dense sky I've seen anywhere, because the Permian Basin has almost no light pollution beyond the drilling operations, and the drilling operations are low on the horizon, and the sky above them is enormous and dark and full. I sat in the cab of the W900, and I looked at that sky through the windshield for a long time. I was 27 years old. I had driven since I was 19. The truck was paid down to almost nothing. The routes were mine. The shippers knew my name. Roy was reliable. The second truck was a thought that was becoming a plan. I had a brother who needed me to disappear, and I was going to disappear, and the life that was almost built was going to stop being built. I didn't grieve it that night. I want to be accurate about this, because it matters. I didn't sit in the cab on that caliche road outside Odessa and grieve the life that was ending. I was 27, and the decision was made, and grief comes later, when you've had time to understand what you've given up. That night, what I felt was something closer to clarity. The specific clarity that a made decision produces. Not peace, not happiness, but the absence of ambiguity. I knew what I was doing. I knew why. The why was in the kitchen eating cereal with the focused attention of a man who doesn't know yet what his brother is about to give up for him. At some point, maybe midnight, maybe later, the stars had moved enough that I'd lost track of the time. I turned the radio on. Not the CB, the AM radio, the regular broadcast band. West Texas at midnight in 1989 on AM radio is its own thing. A country station out of Lubbock fading in and out. A talk station from somewhere further east that had more static than voice. And somewhere between channels, a song that I couldn't quite identify. Country. A woman singing something slow about leaving, and not knowing if leaving was the right thing. I listened to the static and the fragments for a while. Then I turned it off. The night was completely quiet after that. No wind, which in West Texas is unusual. The wind is almost always there. Just the specific silence of a high plains night that has decided to be still. I could hear the cooling engine making its sounds, the particular sequence of ticks and contractions that every engine makes as it cools, and I'd heard the W900's cooling sounds for 3 years and knew them the way you know the sounds of a house you've lived in. I'd been living in this truck for 3 years. I thought about that, sitting on the caliche road. The specific arithmetic of it, where I'd slept, where I'd eaten, the truck stops that had been my kitchen and living room, the cab that had been my bedroom, the sleeper behind the seats that had held the small inventory of a life that traveled. A man can live well in a truck if the truck is right, and the man is right for the road. And I had been right for it, in a way that I hadn't expected when I started, and that I was only now, on the night before I was going to leave it, understanding the full weight of. Margaret. The name I'd given her because I was 23, and in love with the idea of the thing I'd built, and too embarrassed to tell anyone. So I'd put my mother's name on it instead, which was its own kind of telling. Somewhere around 2 in the morning, I climbed into the sleeper and lay down. I didn't expect to sleep, and I did sleep, which is either the gift of youth or the mercy of a body that understands that the next day requires something of it and has decided to prepare, regardless of what the mind is doing. I slept until 5. I drove back to Midland in the first light of September 14th, the sky going from black to grey to the specific pale gold that West Texas mornings have before the heat takes over. The caliche dust on the W900 sides catching the early light, the Cummins engine running the way it always ran, which was correctly. That morning is the last morning I remember, as Eddie Crane. After that morning, everything is the other name. Now let me tell you about Albuquerque, because the 6 weeks in Albuquerque are the 6 weeks that made the 30 years possible. The diner where I worked was on Central Avenue, which is what Route 66 becomes when it runs through Albuquerque, and it was the kind of place that has been on Route 66 since Route 66 was the road and has absorbed some of the road's quality. Transient, functional, serving people who are passing through and people who are staying and treating both the same, which is the correct policy for a place on a road like that. I washed dishes the first week, moved to the grill the second week because the grill man had a family emergency and someone had to cover it, and I told the owner I could cook, which was true if basic. The owner was a woman named Consuelo, who'd been running the diner since her husband died in 1974, and who had the specific authority of a woman who has been running something alone for a long time and has decided that the running of it is her purpose and has made her peace with that purpose completely. She paid me cash at the end of each shift and didn't ask about the situation that had brought a West Texas truck driver to Albuquerque without a truck. In the third week, she asked. Not directly. Consuelo didn't do things directly. She did them from the angle that got the honest answer rather than the prepared one. She said, "You're not from here." I said, "No, I'm from Texas." She said, "What kind of Texas?" I said, "The West Texas kind." She looked at me with the specific assessment of a woman who has fed a lot of people who were passing through and has learned to read the difference between passing through and running from. She said, "You need papers, not a question." I looked at her. She said, "I'm not asking what for. I'm telling you what you need." She gave me a name. A man who worked out of a print shop on 4th Street who could help with the kind of paperwork that a man needs when he's going to stop being who he was. This was 1989. The world was different in 1989 in ways that are relevant here, and that I'm not going to describe in detail for obvious reasons. What I'll say is that the man at the print shop on 4th Street was competent and careful and charged me what I had left of the $300, and that what he produced was sufficient for the purpose. I left Albuquerque with a name that wasn't mine, and a social security card that wasn't mine, and a birth certificate that said I'd been born in a town in New Mexico that I'd never been to, and a sense of myself that had been divided. The Eddie Crane part, which was going into the category of things that were real but couldn't be acknowledged, and the new part, which was going to have to become real through the living of it. The living of it took 30 years. I drove east from Albuquerque. Not Texas. I didn't go back to Texas, not for 30 years, not until the Amarillo parking lot in 2019, where I met Tommy's daughters and pretended to be a friend from a long time ago. I drove east because east was not west, and west was where I'd been, and the new name needed new geography to become real. I found driving work in Arkansas, which in 1990 had a shortage of commercial drivers, that a man with a CDL, and I had my CDL, issued to Eddie Crane, which presented a problem that I solved by retaking the test in my new name, which required a period of not driving commercially while the paperwork processed, which was its own specific kind of suffering for a man who had been driving for 8 years, could fill. I drove regional in Arkansas for 2 years, then Tennessee, then the Ohio runs that I did for 7 years for a carrier out of Columbus, then the Midwest years, the I-80 corridor, the flat country that Eddie Crane would not have recognized as his natural landscape, and that the man with the new name made his anyway. I was good at the job under the new name the same way I'd been good at it as Eddie Crane, because what the job required was the same regardless of what the paperwork said. Attention, reliability, the specific relationship with a truck that comes from treating it as something more than equipment. I didn't name the trucks I drove after Albuquerque. That had been Eddie Crane's thing, and Eddie Crane was in the category of real but unacknowledged, and naming a truck was too close to that edge. I kept one thing from before. The logbooks, the physical paper logs from the W900 years, which I'd taken with me from the Midland yard, which have been in a box in every room I've lived in for 34 years. Not because they're useful, because they're mine. Not the new names, not the man who left Albuquerque's. Eddie Crane's. His handwriting, his roots, his hours. The specific record of a man who drove a midnight blue W900 on the West Texas corridors from 1986 to 1989, and who was good at it and who gave it up because the giving up was what the situation required. The box is in the corner of the room where I'm sitting. I've moved it 16 times. It's the one thing I've moved every time without reconsidering. The September 14th calls with Tommy started in 1997, the first time he called the number I'd given him for a genuine emergency. It wasn't an emergency. He just needed to talk to someone who knew, and the only someone who knew was me. We talked for 2 hours that first call. He told me about his wife, who he'd married in 1993. He told me about his job. He didn't tell me about my mother, which I understood to mean she was alive, and he knew I couldn't call her. I said, "Does Mama know I'm alive?" He said, "She knows." I said, "How does she know?" He said, "She just knows. She told me once, Eddie's alive. He's just somewhere else." I sat with that for a long time. My mother knew, in the way that mothers know things that nobody has told them. She knew, and she lived with the knowing for 22 years, and she died in 2011 with it, and I wasn't there. And she was the woman whose name I'd put on the truck that I'd been forced to leave in a yard in Midland, Texas, on a September afternoon in 1989. The truck is 34 years gone. The name is 34 years gone. The mother is 13 years gone. The brother is 60 years old and has grandchildren coming. The highway outside the window just got a truck. A flatbed this time, loaded with pipe. Permian Basin pipe, I'd guess from the look of it, though I'm a long way from the Permian Basin, and the guess is probably wrong. It went west, which is toward Texas, which is the direction that Eddie Crane went, in everything except the Greyhound bus he took in the other direction in September of 1989. I watched it until it was gone. Then I stopped the camera. Then I started it again, because there was one more thing. The thing is this. I don't know if I made the right choice. I want to be clear about that, because I've been telling this story in a way that implies a certainty I don't entirely have. I know what I chose. I know why I chose it. I know that Tommy is alive, and his daughters exist, and there's a great niece or great nephew coming, and all of that is real, and all of that is the downstream of the choice. What I don't know, what I'll never know, is what the downstream of the other choice would have been. The choice where I didn't get on the bus. The choice where Eddie Crane stayed. Eddie Crane and found some other way. Or didn't find a way. Or found a way that cost something different. I'll never know what my mother's 22 years would have been if her son had stayed. I'll never know what I would have built if the second truck had happened and the routes had expanded and Roy Billings had been right about the limits. 34 years is a long time to not know something. It doesn't get shorter. The highway outside is empty again. The afternoon is going toward evening. The light is doing what late afternoon light does in this part of the country, whatever part of the country this is, going from direct to angled to something softer that makes everything look like it's being reconsidered. Eddie Crane drove a midnight blue Kenworth W900 across the West Texas plains in the best 3 years of his life, and then put his hand on the hood and walked away. And somewhere in a lot, in Midland, there's a photograph of a woman in front of a house in Odessa that has been through owners that Eddie Crane doesn't know about, and that is in a truck that is somewhere in the world or is no longer in the world, and that he will not look for. The logbooks are in the box in the corner. That's enough. Roll safe. Know what you're carrying and know what you're leaving behind when you set it down. Sometimes you don't get to choose which is which.